Tim Carney, the senior political columnist at the Washington Examiner, and I'm here with Mark Schmitt, a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Mark, why don't you get us down the topic of the day, which I guess is a debt ceiling negotiation.
Yeah, I think I wanted to talk a little bit about the debt ceiling battle. I guess really just about half an hour ago I saw the I don't know, in the email circles that I'm in, there was a lot of debate about what Mitch McConnell meant. Now that people are starting to look at votes in the Senate as well as the Boehner versus Cantor battle in the House, and McConnell launched a blistering attack on the president, which kind of made it sound like he wouldn't put up with anything. And then at the end, he said something like, we will do the right thing, which is for the government not to default on its debt, which was an interesting sort of backdrop. And then it came out in Politico that he has a very elaborate plan for increasing the debt ceiling in three tiers, which would require a vote of disapproval at each point, and the president would have to propose budget cuts at each point. Since Mitch McConnell is basically 100% an amoral political operative and not necessarily somebody who cares about the deficit one way or another, what this is a pretty transparent way to sort of set something up where these votes of disapproval could be structured in a way that the Republicans could all vote to disapprove the increase, and Democrats would have to vote to approve it. And if they didn't reach a veto-proof majority, it would go ahead. So
it gives Republicans a bunch of free votes against Obama.
3 free votes between now and the election. I don't really see. It's kind of amazing in its kind of Rube Goldberg nature, but I'm not.
And I don't think it's going to matter because I don't think it's going to fool anybody. In other words, I think Mitch McConnell has spent Mitch McConnell has spent a couple of years underestimating the conservative base's seriousness about shrinking government. He thought Trey Grayson was a shoo-in. He thought Marco Rubio had no chance. Again and again, he not just sort of sided against the Tea Party, but he showed himself to not have a very high opinion of them. And I think that's what's going on here. I think this political piece just hit. I just got back from a lunch. Already I'm seeing people buzzing about it. I think by the end of the day, this will be kind of the thing against which the right will rally. Now, I say this on a Tuesday when this will hit this blogging heads will hit the internet Wednesday, and it might already be proven wrong, or it might be obvious. But I don't. Or
it might just disappear so quickly that nobody has time to rally against it.
That everybody tomorrow will be wondering what we were talking about today. I think that I was interested in, speaking of sort of rhetorical tricks, and you just passed along to me a piece you had written about the synecdoche and the corporate jets and the meaning of Obama's talking about that. And this is something that has mattered to me. You were talking about amoral political animals. I think what we have here coming from Obama is a bunch of sort of contentless political rhetoric. I think maybe the best way to go forward on this is you explain why you think it's what Obama's trying to accomplish by talking about the corporate jets, and I'll explain why I think it's not.
I wrote a piece in the New Republic the other day, and basically I was trying to get at why Democrats often fail to connect with using metaphorical language, like when Obama, in his press conference last week, raised the topic of corporate, basically summed up the budget debate as a choice between kids' health and corporate tax breaks for corporate jets. Used that phrase about 6 times. Now, obviously, he didn't mean tax breaks for corporate jets are a metaphor for a whole bunch of things in the tax code, a whole bunch of things that Republicans would protect. But of course, it immediately came down to an argument about corporate jets, and there was a piece in the National Journal comparing reducing the accelerated depreciation to the luxury tax on boats in the early 1990s. Charles Krauthammer mocked him for, if he collected this corporate jet tax, which obviously, and you pointed out, isn't really it is really a distinct corporate jet tax break. Category that, if whatever that amount would be, would take 5,000 years to pay down half the debt.
Yes.
Last year, whatever. It was just mocked as something being about corporate jets, and Democrats sort of sometimes have a failure to make that connection more broadly. And a classic example that's bugged me for years. So in a way, this was one of those columns where it's an excuse to write about something that has always been annoyed me, which was
I have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah.
What do you mean?
I was just joking as if I had never done
it. Right, we all do that. Right.
Yeah.
You got to keep that little package of things in your mind. When John Kerry in 2004 talked about the Benedict Arnold companies, and the listener was supposed to think, oh yeah, all those damn outsourcing corporations taking our American jobs, where in fact he really was sort of, but the metaphor didn't quite work, and he was himself kind of trying to say, I didn't really mean outsourcing, I meant this particular tax corporate inversion where companies would charter themselves in Bermuda to really just to kind of manage their foreign source taxation in a complicated way that applied to maybe 10 companies.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like I do think it's a situation where sometimes where Democrats want to kind of claim, and Republicans have their version of this too, but there's a desire to claim the language of populism, like corporate jets, but you're really not going all the way to either to take on the real popular, if you really want to say corporate America bankrupting our country, if you really want to adopt populist language, you got to go a lot further than the general.
And Obama,
or just be straightforward about what that we all actually are going to have to say.
And this is what drives me crazy about Obama trying to do the corporate jet big oil talk, because he uses his talk, and he has spent his whole presidency pretending to fight against the special interests when that has not been what he's doing. A lot of people pointed out that he thought, in 2009, this corporate jet tax break, so to speak, was stimulating. He thought he put in a stimulus. And again, the question is about whether you depreciate it over 5 years, which commercial jets get depreciated or over 7 years. So this is an arcane tax issue. And the reason I don't think it's illegitimate for conservatives to beat up on Obama for this, partly is because Obama isn't trying to do what you're suggesting in the article. He's not really trying to get rid of tax loopholes, because he's making as many as he wants to destroy. If you convert your car to be your regular car to run on plug-in electricity, I think the stimulus has a tax break for that. If you buy a computer and you have a kid going off to college, you got a special tax break for that. Big businesses are getting these so-called tax credits, but they're really checks from the Treasury for building windmills or putting solar panels on their roof if they're, a gas station or something. There's all these special tax credits that Obama is making. Tons of special treatment in the tax code that he's pushing. And when he's talking about big oil, he's not talking mostly about tax cuts that just oil companies get. He's talking about tax cuts that everybody gets, or every, coal mining gets it and manufacturing gets it, and he wants to just exclude the big oil companies from it. So it's not a synecdoche. It's not Obama using corporate jets to talk about all these special carve-outs, because he's not going after all the special carve-outs. He's going after the ones that are easy to go at, that are politically unpopular. In other words, he's not trying to use a particular to represent the whole. He's just trying to do class warfare demagoguery. That's why it's not working. That's why we're right to sort of respond and make fun of it.
Well, I think these are this is very small potatoes to be real class warfare. He's also not saying. Class warfare is saying, God damn it, we're gonna really jack up the rates on the wealthy, and we're going to get rid of that.
I said it's just class warfare rhetoric.
Loophole. Yeah.
It's a way to do the class warfare rhetoric without actually having to really attack rich people.
Well, that's right, exactly. Now, I do think that one response to it would be to say that the element of the the element of the Republican Party that is signed on to Grover Norquist's pledge, and I wish we'd make a little bit more of a big deal of like your sacred pledge seems to be not to the people or to the Constitution, but to a tax lobbyist named Grover Norquist. The people who've really taken Grover Norquist's pledge seriously will not accept any adjustment to even any kind of tax expenditure. And you
unless it is paired with a reduction in rates.
Unless it is paired with an equal tax increase. But I mean, we've got to get the camel's nose under the door of being able to have a serious conversation about tax expenditures in the context of tax reform before we're going to be able to do anything. So you could take the easiest tax expenditures. I mean, back in the tax reform of the early 1980s, a small number of companies that paid no taxes at all because they accumulated all the different credits and deductions became a potent symbol that did allow you to then clear out a lot of the crap that had accumulated in the tax code. So if Obama were serious about big time tax reform, which I would hope he is, I'm one of those people who always thinks there's tax reform right around the corner. But if he could be, beginning to break through on some of the tax expenditures would be kind of a necessary first step.
But he's been the guy who's been expanding. He's expanding the tax expenditure.
Well, I mean, a lot of things are done,
and he calls them investments in our future.
There's not much you can do. I mean, given the limits of shovel-ready projects and the political configuration, there isn't much you can do to get cash into the economy fast, other than tax credits.
So I think this points to a tension between the sort of good government and tax reform talk that Obama has, and what I believe in you is a real desire for that good government stuff on the one hand, and then on the other hand, this Obama view, and I think it's widely held on the left, of the government trying to shape the economy in the appropriate way. What do tax expenditures do? What do tax credits do? They pick winners and losers. I think that the market should pick winners and losers. And that's, as far as I can tell, a notion that a lot of liberals, especially our president, reject. So if you're going to have the economy the government sort of steering the economy, you can't have that and a clean tax code. Or I shouldn't say you can have that and a clean tax code. You're probably going to accomplish your government steering of the economy through muddying up the tax code. So the two goals are at odds. I don't think Obama is serious at all about tax reform.
Well, I mean, we'll see. I hope so. I mean, there's certainly many. The default position of Democrats has always been, tax credit, tax credit, tax credit. I did a piece at the beginning of the 2008 primaries, running through all the different tax credits that all the candidates, they're all equally deranged about this. And one of them had, actually, I guess it was Obama had tax credits for fatherhood and tax credits for, one thing or another. A lot of them not corporate tax credits, and there's a place for tax credits in some respects. And the other thing is, of course, he got knocked back so quickly, even by. I mean, one of the first things that happened in the administration was an effort to pare back the charitable tax deduction, in a very modified, limited way, and he just kind of got slammed by the entire community of nonprofits, which are generally more democratically set of lobbyists. So it's hard to do even if you are serious about it, but. I think it's just an endemic issue on the endemic problem for Democrats to want to approach everything with tax credits rather than saying, okay, we're going to step up and we're going to actually declare this, not a public good, a merit good, I guess. We're going to declare this something that the government has a role in, and we're going to do it, and we're going to make sure it happens. Which is, what would FDR do? He wouldn't monkey around with much of considerable tax credit, but it's
and the tax
has to do with politics too, and wanting to feeling like tax breaks are inoffensive.
It's a way to fool Republicans into doing the welfare programs Democrats want to do, right? When there was a debate about defunding Planned Parenthood, Joshua Barrows, a libertarian more or less, said. if the Democrats had thought ahead of time, they would have made a tax credit for abortion providers instead of actually providing family planning subsidies to Planned Parenthood, because then no Republican would want to be hiking taxes on anybody, or at least make it more difficult for them. Right. And so, I mean, some of these, the ethanol tax credit is both, it's refundable and it comes in the form of a check. And so what I do as a ethanol blender, so that could mean I own a gas station and I get the ethanol, I get the gasoline, I mix it together. I'm paying the fuel excise tax of whatever, 18 cents a gallon. But that doesn't go, I don't tell I don't even know who this is, Department of Energy, I guess. I don't even tell the Department of Energy what I paid in my excise tax, because that's just a separate thing. I just fill out a form. This is how many gallons of ethanol I blended, and I send in the form, and they send me back a check of, what is it now, 45 cents for every gallon of ethanol I blended. Some blenders don't sell the gasoline, so they are not paying the excise tax. So they're just getting the checks as a credit against an excise tax that they never pay. So how is this not just a payment for buying ethanol? But because it's in the tax code, it makes it sort of trickier for Republicans, especially because of the pledge that you're talking about, to undo it.
The concept of tax expenditures it's a really important concept. We should be clear about them, and we should be able to get rid of them.
I would get rid of all of them. I would get rid of more than you would probably. I would want to reduce rates too. And part of this comes down to a sort of base philosophical thing. I don't think the government needs to be 20% of our GDP. I think if the government were less than 17%, government spending were less than 17% of our GDP, that would be good. So I want taxes to be a lower percentage. But one of the things that you can do is that you can cut taxes and raise revenue without relying on sort of the Laffer curve writ large, but a smaller kind of Laffer curve, which on ethanol is, if we stop paying people to squeeze alcohol out of corn, which is what we're doing with ethanol, then, and we were to cut the fuel excise tax, which would be a way to lower gasoline prices, and that's what it's a credit against. If we were to do both of those things, there would be sort of, we'd be better off because people wouldn't be wasting money on something that's as inefficient as ethanol is. And so tax revenues across the board would go up while people's taxes across the board would go down if we so you call it an equal size cut in rates to the hike and getting rid of the credit, but it's sort of a rising tide that lifts both the take-home profits of everybody at the end of the day as well as the government revenue, because these tax credits are inherently distorting. They make the economy poorer, and so if we take them away, we're making the economy richer, and we get the stimulative effect without necessarily having to rely on just sort of the stimulative effect of the rate reductions. Am I being clear?
Yeah, no, totally clear. And I basically agree with that. I don't believe in setting an arbitrary rate for the what we think the level of government should be, and I think there's things that we can if we want to look at other things like we could obviously, for example, spend less on wasteful health care as a society, while government might constitute a larger share of what we do in health care, and probably could manage could manage that cost reduction a little more effectively. I mean, that's a largely general statement, but I think that. I don't know. Not everything matches up as neatly as ethanol and the fuel excise tax. I mean, I would certainly, for example, I would get rid of any preferential treatment of capital gains and dividend income and lower the rates. I mean, let all income be treated the same, and you're in a position where you can lower the rates. I mean, that's how far I would go. I don't know if you'd go that far, actually.
I think that would be an interesting question. Why is some income taxed at a lower rate? Why have we decided that sort of investing in these sort of things that provide capital gains is a more worthwhile thing to invest in than, say, just working or just having your own business that may not be gaining in assets but is returning a profit. That's one of those sort of points, and I'm saying this as a question just because there have been much bigger debates about capital gains in the past that I wasn't around for. I was not yet watching C-SPAN during Kemp Raw and all that stuff. So I don't know all the arguments, but it is something that occurs to me. And if you're sort of looking for
because one party is the party of capital, and the party of capital got to write those rules. And that's one explanation. The other explanation is that it does, if you can get a jump in revenues if you cut capital gains tax. The act of cutting them causes people to realize gains, and suddenly you have a little jump in revenue, which doesn't play out in the long term. But it's a cheap way of getting a little bit of a boost.
I'm glad you used that word because you reminded me of something else I wanted to talk about. A cheap way. One of the things that drives me crazy is the sort of ticky-tack way in which governors and Congress and presidents try to bleed us, nickel and dime us on taxes. Tim Pawlenty's defense was that he didn't raise taxes. He just instituted a cigarette tax, so it wasn't broad-based. There are other presidents, governors, whatever, and they'll add little tanning bed tax. And then they expanded S-chip with expanding the federal cigarette tax, and all these things just drive me crazy. I would love a debate and where there was, a lot of things would be user fees, but basically, if we were going to have an income tax, which, I'd abolish it, but we won't get into that now. If we were to have an income tax, that every time you wanted to spend more, we had to raise the income tax, and we had to raise it on everybody. You say it's graduated, whatever, but if you're going to raise the income tax on one person, you got to raise it on everybody, and that's the only way to get new tax revenue for the government is through that one thing. So that's how our spending debates would be had. Instead of, we're going to expand this state children's health insurance program just by taxing cigarettes. We're going to expand our subsidies for Medicaid and Medicare and that sort of thing, but we're going to do it with a tanning bed tax and with this, Form 990 horrible idea that we'd actually be ratcheting up rates. We're going to make you give up a little bit more of your money because this is how much of a priority. I think if that was a debate, I think my side would win a lot more than we do as far as preventing the spending.
I think that's probably right. Although I think there's a place for some to go via taxes. I mean, I think when you look at it, especially in most states now, as far as I'm concerned, everything that you do by raising the cigarette tax is, you're basically forcing people who are at this point, deeply in the throes of an unbreakable physical addiction. To pay more and more of the cost of government. That's probably regressive. Their demand for cigarettes is actually inelastic, because of the addiction, and I think that's just incredibly immoral. I think the first time, you do a cigarette tax in 1980, and you start to make the cost of a pack reflect the actual cost in healthcare and some of the other things, and just use it to pursue a social goal. I have much less of a problem with it than I do in 2011, where I'm not even sure what the proportion of the population that is that's serious smokers anymore. It's got to be pretty small. But you're just milking more and more out of them.
And my friend Peter Suderman has an article at Reason Magazine about how Arizona's running out of smokers and how bad that is for the state's treasury.
You don't want to make things that you believe in. And there are a lot of liberals. I used to work with a bunch of, I still do sometimes, a bunch of little state think tanks that are connected to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And they'll always try to tell the state legislators, please don't make this valuable program dependent on a tax that you actually want the revenues to disappear. In a best of all worlds, you won't get cigarette tax revenue, and then where are you if you've made programs completely dependent?
Well, and part of the way politicians get around that is they pretend that this is almost a user fee, right? They're pretending that these taxes are going to cover the cost of treating smokers. And if it were a user fee, then as demand for it as smoking went down and the revenue went down, the need for the money would go down. But that's not what the state children's health insurance plan is.
Right, and especially as children's health insurance isn't covering the smokers anyway. It isn't covering smoking-related costs. Hopefully it isn't. But it seems to me, very often a libertarian position, and I don't know, do you consider yourself a libertarian? Or?
Yeah, libertarian, conservative.
A libertarian position would be legalize marijuana, tax the hell out of it,
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and this is also what I heard about like organ sales. Like instead of organ donation, you'd be able to sell your kidneys and that sort of stuff. And it's actually something on which I don't necessarily come down on that sort of side. I think that's like a selling point. I often think that maybe freedom is preserved better in some cases, by outright prohibition than by meddling. When it comes to organ sales, there's a big debate on this. We don't have to go down this road. But I think when they say regulate and tax marijuana and legalize it, I think that's partly sort of a way of trying to just reach out to the left and get more, and also sort of, not just the left, but sort of tamp down some of the fears of sort of, people worried about too much pot smoking and that sort of thing.
Right. So, taxation is a relatively clean form of regulation.
Yeah.
Carbon tax, presumably as a libertarian, you would prefer a straightforward carbon tax to an array of other taxes plus all sorts of, top-down, all sorts of, command and control regulation in the energy industry. Right?
I'd prefer, if I was to do anything, one of these, if I had to choose among all the big regulations on climate, I would choose like 100% auction cap and trade with all the revenue, the cap and dividend, with all the revenue sent back to people, to taxpayers or whatever. Because that would just be much cleaner. But it's not going to happen because you don't get a political coalition of people looking for their concentrated benefit from that as much. Why were you able to get natural gas and electricity people doing this sort of thing? Sorry, a fan was just asking for my attention there. Why were you able to get all these big businesses going for the climate change bill? Partly because they were getting their special carve-outs and their special favors. And so this is one of the stories I often tell about regulation, is that often some liberal has some fairly clean, if more socialist plan, and that what ends up getting through at the end of the day is sort of the Max Baucus General Electric compromise, which pleases the sort of the true believers on neither side.
Right. But isn't that to some extent just a natural result of a legislative process?
Yeah, and it's another argument not to get the government involved in the first place, because that is a natural result, because sort of the whole talk of industry capture always gets at a couple. The idea is that Ralph Nader would talk about is, these agencies get created in order to regulate an industry, but then the industry spends so much and hires so many of the revolving door lobbyists that eventually they capture the agency and the agency starts serving their interests. This happens. Mineral Management Service is probably the best example of it. But I think they're not these regulatory agencies that are sort of kidnapped. As I've written, their parents are politicians and business. Like, industry is their father. It's in utero belongs to industry. It's not getting kidnapped later on. Right. That a lot of these regulatory agencies are created to protect, not created to. The big businesses like them in order to protect against the smaller ones, or they know it's something they can deal with. There's even some of that talk by the banks on the Consumer Financial Protection Board. When the banks started acting as a group, it was opposition, but some of the individual banks, Goldman was saying, you know what, maybe we can deal with this.
Right. And I totally agree with you. I think there is such a thing as regulatory capture, but it's a really small element compared to, the basic dynamic in which Washington becomes a playground for fights for intra-industry or
But
intra-industry.
that's ultimately a libertarian. That's an argument on the libertarian side of the scale, right? Is that whenever government is getting involved, that's giving more power to the lobbyists and thus giving more power to big business.
Well, I mean, it could be an argument on the libertarian side of the scale, but somebody can, I mean, I would make it to say that, I would use that argument to say that where government gets involved, it should be with a relatively clean and fairly direct model. So, for example, I would be more comfortable. You know, a carbon tax, for example, doesn't have a large regulatory structure that goes with it. It's a pretty straightforward system that doesn't prefer any. Yeah. I mean, it's weighted against carbon energy, but other than that, it's not choosing among natural gas or electricity or whatever, other than in the content of carbon it's producing, and it doesn't require a whole regulatory structure that can be gained and captured. So I think there are things that we should do. I think there are things that government should do, and there are things that the market's going to do a crappy job of, left alone, and government should do those things. But I think it should do it as, you know, there are clean ways to do them.
Yeah. No, and if you're arguing that greenhouse gases have these externalized costs and that we need to do the best we can. I mean, there's the libertarian-sounding argument to make. We need to do the best we can to approximate that these emitters are paying the full cost. That's sort of the best argument. And again, that would be a 100% auction cap and trade or a carbon tax, as you're saying. But government programs like that will always end up focusing too narrow and making sort of bigger, worse externalities, in my view. In other words, I always look at the corporate average fuel economy standards, which, because they said, oh well, you can't, you know, if you put pickup trucks in the same as regular cars, and farmers will get the shaft, and so then they made two different classes of cars. Of course, that ends up leading to everybody driving SUVs. And so, does that help? And then,
or they're reclassifying trucks as cars for one purpose. Yeah.
And you know who likes corporate average fuel economy standards is Alcoa. Alcoa makes aluminum car frames. They make them in Australia in an incredibly energy-intensive process that even just the chemical process necessarily gives off very strong greenhouse gases. So the sort of dust-to-dust greenhouse gas footprint of an aluminum car frame is much greater, as is the energy footprint. But if you just measure the fuel economy of the car, well, aluminum is much more environmentally friendly. So it's focusing, it's almost like they're just looking at the tailpipe, and they're not looking at the factory over on the edge of town or halfway across the world in Australia that's doing it. And it's the same thing with any carbon tax, is that to the degree it drives jobs to China, it makes things dirtier. And so this is why, and to step away from carbon for one second, this is why we like prices, right? Because prices work everything in. Prices don't say, like corporate average fuel economy, just meet this magic mathematical formula. They don't do sort of the, ethanol is worth this much. It's not arbitrary. It's not bureaucrats. It's not congressmen setting the values. The market is setting the values. And so, but if you take a step back to carbon, you would need basically a global carbon tax for it to
well, maybe.
I
like prices too. I really honestly do. But, you know, the price of carbon fuel does not reflect the cost, and it's perfectly reasonable in lots of situations, whether it's cigarettes or carbon, to say, to use, you know, taxes are a way of putting a little weight on the scale of the price of the price system, as opposed to creating a regulatory structure that's entirely separate from the price system. And that seems to me something that libertarians should be significantly more comfortable with than a regulatory structure.
Yes, I agree. And I would be, you know, if this became a fait accompli, we were going to get this tax, I would be joining the Brad Plumer at the New Republic and trying to make sure that the coal industry and the natural gas industry and General Electric weren't tilting it to their favor.
Well, it's funny. I mean, it does seem like what you have here is a you know, you can have a common ground here between kind of, you know, sort of I don't know what you'd call us, kind of clean government liberals, or liberals who favor a government that acts, as directly and specifically and without a lot of tax reformers, for example, like me, and then libertarians who see some of the same issues and take it in the libertarian direction. Those are two. There, you can find some common ground there. You can find some. We're reacting to some common understandings, and neither one is reflected in any way in either of the two political parties.
Well, we got Rand Paul in the Senate now, and Mike Lee, and to some extent Jim DeMint, and I guess you have Bernie Sanders. Those were always my favorite votes. Is when you'd occasionally. I don't know if I ever found any actual 433-2 votes in the House, but I feel like there were some votes where it was Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders were at least the only two speaking against it. Yeah. No, and on the Senate you would get some of those too. On the bailout, that was definitely one of those votes. But I guess that gives us a news hook for our last topic, which maybe you don't care about, but I do. Is Ron Paul says he is not running for re-election, and Jeff Flake is running for the U.S. Senate. So those are by far, without a doubt, the two men with the best record of fighting for limited government and free markets in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, the Senate is much better than it's been as far as having a few sort of hardcore right-wingers that I love than it's been any time since I've been here. I mean, but the House, losing those two, is a big loss. And so then the question...
Well, individual House members don't matter very much.
How
does Ron Paul matter as a member of the House
versus
not a member of the House?
Yeah, no, you're right. He's not like a senator who can hold up a bill and introduce and cast an important vote or that sort of thing. So yeah, no, I guess that is a question. For me, am I just getting nostalgia? Ron Paul's got to leave the House eventually. He might change his mind.
He's in his late 70s. He's like 76.
Yeah, I don't know. I assume he's mortal, and so he's going to leave the House one way or another eventually. And I would much rather have Senator Jeff Flake than Congressman Jeff Flake for reasons you're suggesting. But to me, the next question it opens up, though, is are these Tea Party people sort of the real crusaders that they say they are? And when I was looking at, for instance, earmark votes, I found that in my small sample size, freshmen were, in fact, less likely to vote against the leadership on appropriations. Not earmarks. These were amendments to remove some appropriations, so it's sort of an un-earmark.
Right.
And you had Jeff Flake and Ron Paul voting to strip out this spending, and you had a couple of freshmen, even a couple of freshmen on the Appropriations Committee doing it. But at least from what I was looking at, the freshmen were less likely to buck the party leadership on those spending votes than other Republicans were. So this will be an interesting question: are there at least a handful of people in that class?
It's still a go-along to get along institution.
Yeah, and will there be a couple people rising up who are going to be sort of the new kind of cult heroes? Most people probably didn't know who Jeff Flake was until he was running for Senate, but sort of Jeff Flake, Ron Paul was almost a phrase for a lot of us limited government guys. Those two guys were the heroes in the House. And,
let me ask one question, and then I want to come back. I want to come back a little bit to the degree to which people are sincere. Does Ron Paul? I know that Ron Paul is going to run for. He is going to run for president again, or is that?
He's running for president. Yeah. Yep.
So but does his sort of stepping down, clearly in some way stepping back from public life, does this move Gary Johnson into a much more prominent role?
I don't know, because Paul is framing his departure from the House as a way to concentrate more on the presidential race.
Yeah.
But I'm somebody who sort of hopes that Paul and Johnson can kind of supplement each other rather than take away from each other. I definitely seen their supporter, and libertarians are the most divisive people I know. Well, second only to like the really cranky paleo-conservatives, but of any sort of sizable group, libertarians.
Well, you can come over to the left. I'll introduce you to some interesting
fights.
You got we got some interesting internal.
But libertarians, partly because they have enough of sort of their own purity tests that they'll invoke, and this is not as big anymore. I think they're generally a little more pragmatic, and but so the supporters have been going after each other. But I feel like Paul and Johnson can end up supplementing each other. Hopefully, not talking all the time about heroin. I don't think that's the most important issue or terribly winning issue. Hopefully, from my perspective, going after the sort of the stuff that the other Republicans don't, which is more of the farm subsidies and corporate welfare and the education type stuff.
Johnson seems to me to be a more authentic libertarian in that he does take the social issues seriously.
Well, Ron Paul he doesn't put an emphasis on drugs, but he agrees, and I think a lot of times the word libertarian carries with it so much baggage, where I've had fellow Catholics of mine, if I call myself a libertarian, say, don't call yourself a libertarian, Tim. You go to church. You believe in God. You're not a libertarian. And, of course, that doesn't have anything to do with it. Right. And then I also have libertarians.
Ayn Rand would not approve, however.
Yes, exactly. No, I think to the degree that they disagree on certain issues, those are sort of widely accepted, for example, abortion, that you can have a debate on libertarian grounds about those issues and about your priorities.
Now, I have to say, I generally feel like it's. I don't go too wrong by assuming that a lot of other people who call themselves. I think Johnson is a straight up libertarian. I think that for the most part, I think Paul is. A lot of these other guys, I think, talk. It's just like populism on the Democratic Party. They talk some of the talk, and they don't like to walk all the walk. And I'll give you an example of this. I was, the story came out last week about Paul Ryan at Bistro Beast, two bottles of $350 wine. And on this same night, I was on the Amtrak back from New York on the Acela, and there's Senator Jim DeMint on the subsidized Amtrak service, happily making his way back to Washington. And I didn't bother him about it, but I did. My smartphone, I looked up. Of course, he's voted against every penny for Amtrak along the way. He sponsored an amendment to allow people to carry guns on Amtrak.
But I think it's the silliest thing to charge that that's some sort of hypocrisy. Should I have to stay off the public sidewalks? It's exactly the same thing as saying, liberals, if you want a 90% tax hike and your tax rate and you're not paying it. Obama.
Well, do you not believe in public sidewalks? Do you believe that sidewalks aren't something that a local government should provide?
On the local level, I become less of a libertarian, and I believe in local sidewalks. I don't want federal sidewalks except in districts. But, that's basically the way it goes. But the fact of the matter is that when the government comes in, and I wrote about Michelle Bachmann on this, on her husband taking Medicaid money. Federal government comes in, or state government, or whoever, and they distort the economy tremendously. And so you're going to pay the prices for it. I paid the price for student loan subsidies. Yes, I pay the price for student loan subsidies. Without Medicaid, Marcus Bachmann's clients would be coming in either with more subsidy from a church or something else, or he would be serving more of them pro bono and less of his money would be going to taxes. The market gets the economy gets completely reshaped, and you're living within it. But it's a good question, and I've written a little bit about it. But there's a spectrum what was the guy's name? Alan Beale or Andy Beale, name of a banker, who says, look, I'm a total libertarian. I would get rid of all of these bailouts and stuff. But his whole business model is getting basically hedge funds to make deposits in FDIC insured banks, using then FDIC insurance as a backstop, so he's able to take more risk without having to pay a risk premium for the borrowing capital. Wow. And he says, I would abolish this, but as long as it's there, I'm going to take advantage of it. That seems to me a couple steps further than Marcus Bachmann taking Medicaid patients or me or Jim DeMint riding Amtrak.
Right. Or the famous Phil Graham thing about I'm opposed to subsidies of interest, but if the government decides it's going to build a cheese factory on the moon, I want Texas cows to be providing the milk in Texas.
Yeah, no, but then that provides what we Catholics call sort of an occasion of sin. It puts you in the situation where you might not fight as hard against, you might not resist temptation as well, because the temptation is so clear. If you're Phil Gramm and you have that viewpoint, and you know you've got a little bit of political capital, you can either try to kill the cheese factory on the moon, or you can try to kill something else that's maybe slightly less obnoxious. But you know what? Cheese factory on the moon, there's at least a 1 in 30 chance that it's going to end up having Texas cows or whatever. So it takes so that's why when possible, one ought to abstain from engaging in these activities that put you dependent on the government, from the sort of, to speak in a mixture of libertarian and Catholic teaching.
Okay.
So, well, I think we're about time to wrap up. Is
yeah,
there anything else
let's
you
wrap
want
this
to
up.
hit?
I think this is terrific.
All right.
Definitely current with the day's news, and enjoy talking to you.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.